By the late hours of April 29, 1945, Berlin was no longer functioning as a capital city. Soviet artillery had closed in from multiple directions, and explosions could be felt even beneath the ground. Deep below the Reich Chancellery, the Führerbunker had become the final operational space of the collapsing Nazi leadership. Inside the bunker, conditions were confined and tense. Electricity was limited, air circulation was poor, and the sound of shelling was constant. Communication lines with the outside world were fragmented, and reports arriving from the front confirmed that German forces could no longer prevent Soviet entry into the city. Adolf Hitler remained underground, surrounded by a shrinking circle of aides, secretaries, and military staff. The structure of command that once extended across Europe had narrowed to a few rooms and a handful of people. Maps still hung on the walls, but they no longer reflected a reality that could be altered. Above ground, much of Berlin was already in ruins. Soviet troops were advancing street by street, and remaining German units were either retreating or surrendering. There was no functioning evacuation plan for the city, and no realistic prospect of relief forces reaching the bunker. As the night progressed, it became clear to those inside that this was not a temporary shelter. The Führerbunker had become the final setting for decisions that would mark the end of Nazi rule, with no expectation that the hours ahead would change the outcome. As the night continued, activity inside the bunker did not stop. Despite the worsening situation above ground, administrative and personal decisions were still being carried out. Adolf Hitler summoned members of his inner circle, limiting contact to only those who were still present in the bunker. Telephone and radio updates from the outside grew increasingly brief and grim. Reports confirmed that Soviet forces had crossed key positions and were advancing rapidly toward the government district. These updates no longer prompted counterorders or new strategies. They were acknowledged and set aside, as the remaining options had already narrowed. Within the bunker, attention shifted away from military maneuvering toward internal arrangements. Hitler made it clear that he would not leave Berlin. This position had already been communicated earlier, but during these late hours it was reinforced without ambiguity. There would be no attempt to escape, and no relocation to another command post. Those present understood that the focus was no longer on reversing the situation, but on concluding matters inside the bunker. The night moved forward under the weight of that understanding, with decisions being made that were intended to settle what remained unresolved before dawn. In the early hours before dawn, a small group was gathered in one of the bunker's rooms for a brief civil procedure. With only a few witnesses present, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun were formally married. The ceremony was conducted quietly, without any public acknowledgement or celebration. Those in attendance were limited to senior aides and officials who remained in the bunker at that time. There were no speeches, and the moment passed quickly. Once the paperwork was completed, the group dispersed, and normal bunker activity resumed almost immediately. After the ceremony, Eva Braun returned to the living quarters she shared with Hitler. The environment around them did not change. Shelling continued above ground, and communications from the outside remained focused on the advancing Soviet forces. The marriage marked a personal decision made in isolation, taking place as the broader collapse of the regime continued uninterrupted around them. Shortly after the ceremony, Adolf Hitler asked for his personal secretary, Trottel Junge, to be brought into the room. Sitting at a table inside the bunker, he began dictating what would become his final political and personal statements. The process was deliberate and uninterrupted, with Junge typing as he spoke. The text outlined how authority was to be transferred after his death and identified individuals assigned to remaining leadership roles. It also included a personal document addressing property and personal matters. No discussion followed the dictation. The focus remained on completing the documents accurately. Once the dictation ended, the papers were reviewed and prepared for signing. The atmosphere in the room remained controlled and formal, with no visible emotional response from those present. Outside the bunker, the sound of artillery continued without pause. These documents were intended to outlast the bunker itself, recording decisions made while the physical and political structures of the regime were already collapsing above ground. Before dawn, the documents were finalized. Adolf Hitler signed both the political testament and the private will, confirming the decisions he had dictated earlier. Witnesses added their signatures, and multiple copies were prepared to ensure the contents would survive the situation in Berlin. Couriers were selected from among those still capable of moving above ground. They were instructed to leave the bunker separately and carry the documents toward areas not yet fully occupied by Soviet forces. Each courier was given a specific route, with the understanding that the chances of success were uncertain. Once the messengers departed, there was no follow-up communication to confirm whether they had reached their destinations. The bunker returned to its enclosed routine, cut off once again from the outside world. As morning approached, these completed documents became the final official acts issued from Hitler's command, marking the administrative end of his authority even before his death. By the morning of April 30th, the situation outside the bunker was no longer uncertain. Military briefings delivered to Adolf Hitler confirmed that Soviet troops had reached positions within a short distance of the Reich Chancellery. Remaining German units were fragmented, undersupplied, and unable to mount any coordinated defense. Reports from field commanders indicated that attempts to break through Soviet lines had failed. Ammunition shortages and the collapse of communication networks made further resistance ineffective. No relief forces were available, and there was no viable corridor for evacuation. These updates did not lead to new orders. Instead, they reinforced what had already been accepted during the night. Hitler listened to the briefings without interruption and dismissed the officers once the information had been delivered. From this point forward, the bunker operated with the understanding that the military phase was finished. What remained was no longer a question of strategy, but of how the final hours inside the bunker would unfold. Later that morning, Adolf Hitler met with senior figures who were still present in the bunker. Among them was General Helmuth Weidling, the commander responsible for the defense of Berlin. The discussion centered on the city's remaining forces and the feasibility of continued resistance. Weidling explained that German troops were exhausted, surrounded, and unable to hold their positions. Any attempt at a coordinated breakout would fail, and civilian casualties would only increase if fighting continued. The assessment left no room for alternative interpretations. After hearing the report, Hitler authorized Weidling to take responsibility for decisions regarding the city's defense. This effectively ended direct military command from the bunker. The meeting concluded without further instruction, and Weidling departed to carry out what he believed were his final duties. With that exchange, the last formal military link between Hitler and the battle above ground was severed, leaving the bunker isolated from events unfolding across Berlin. As midday approached, the atmosphere inside the bunker became noticeably quieter. With military command no longer being exercised, interactions shifted to brief, personal exchanges. Adolf Hitler moved through the bunker corridors, acknowledging staff members who remained at their posts. These encounters were restrained and formal. There were no speeches or collective gatherings. Individuals were thanked for their service in short conversations, and instructions were given for those who intended to attempt escape later that day. No one was ordered to stay. Eva Braun was present during this period, remaining close to Hitler as preparations continued inside the private quarters. The bunker staff resumed routine tasks, maintaining order despite the certainty of what lay ahead. Above ground, Soviet artillery fire continued uninterrupted. Inside, the structure functioned as it had for weeks, but with the clear understanding that its role as a command center had ended and that the final phase was now underway. During the late morning hours, Adolf Hitler gave specific instructions regarding what was to happen after his death. These directions were communicated to his adjutants and aides, leaving no uncertainty about his intentions. He stated clearly that his body and Eva Braun's were not to be captured or displayed. Arrangements were made using the limited resources still available in the bunker. Containers of petrol were brought inside and set aside for later use. Individuals were assigned the task of carrying out the instructions once the time came, and they acknowledged the orders without discussion. No formal announcement accompanied these preparations. The instructions were treated as procedural, handled in the same controlled manner as other bunker operations. Those involved understood that there would be no opportunity to revise or delay the plan. With these final directions given, the remaining actions inside the bunker moved toward execution rather than planning, and attention shifted fully to the private quarters above. The bunker corridors. Shortly after midday, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun withdrew from the common areas of the bunker. They entered the private living quarters that had been set aside for them, closing the door behind them. Those remaining outside understood that they were not to interrupt or enter unless instructed. The bunker continued operating quietly. Staff members stayed at their posts, and no announcements were made. The sounds from above ground, artillery and collapsing structures, remained constant, but inside, movement was minimal. Time passed without communication from the private rooms. No messages were sent, and no orders followed. The absence of activity marked a clear shift from preparation to finality, recognized by those waiting in the corridor. What remained was a period of silence, during which the bunker's routine held steady, even as the outcome had already been decided. After a period of waiting, those assigned to remain nearby approached the private quarters. When the door was opened, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun were found inside, both deceased. The scene matched the instructions that had been given earlier, leaving no uncertainty about what had occurred. The discovery was handled without delay. There was no attempt to move the bodies immediately, and no formal statement was made inside the bunker at that moment. Confirmation was shared only among the small group responsible for carrying out the next steps. Outside the room, normal bunker operations continued in a subdued manner. Staff members who were not directly involved were kept at a distance, and no general announcement was made. The process moved forward according to the preparations that had already been set in place. With the deaths confirmed, attention shifted from waiting to action, and the final phase of the plan began. Following the confirmation, the bodies were wrapped and prepared for removal from the bunker. Those assigned to the task acted quickly, aware that conditions above ground were deteriorating and that Soviet forces were closing in. The route out of the bunker was cleared as much as possible under the circumstances. The group moved through the emergency exit leading to the Reich Chancellery Garden. Above ground, the area was heavily damaged, with shelling continuing nearby. Despite the danger, the instructions were carried out exactly as they had been given. Once outside, the bodies were placed in a shallow bomb crater. Petrol was poured over them, and the cremation was carried out in the open air. The process was monitored closely, with those present remaining nearby until the task was completed. Afterward, the remains were left at the site, and the group returned underground. The bunker door was sealed again, restoring the separation between the events above ground and those continuing below. Once the group returned to the bunker, operations resumed under a new reality. Adolf Hitler was no longer issuing orders, and authority inside the bunker shifted immediately to those named in the succession arrangements. Communications reflected this change, even as connections with the outside world remained unstable. Joseph Goebbels remained in the bunker, continuing limited coordination with remaining officials. Messages were drafted and transmitted where possible, reflecting the leadership transition that had already been set in motion through the earlier documents. No attempt was made to conceal what had occurred from those still present. The atmosphere underground remained controlled but increasingly tense. Soviet forces were now close enough that movement above ground was becoming more dangerous by the hour. Staff members prepared for either capture or escape, depending on their individual circumstances. With Hitler's role concluded, the bunker functioned no longer as a command center, but as a temporary shelter for the final remnants of the regime. As the afternoon progressed, the situation outside the bunker deteriorated further. Soviet forces tightened their control over the surrounding area, and artillery fire continued to strike near the Reich Chancellery. Movement above ground was now extremely limited, and remaining escape routes were rapidly closing. Inside the bunker, preparations were made for the next stage. Some staff members finalized plans to attempt breakouts under cover of darkness, while others prepared to remain and face capture. Supplies were distributed, documents were secured or destroyed, and sensitive materials were removed from circulation. There were no further strategic discussions. The focus was on individual decisions rather than centralized control. Each person remaining underground understood that the structure protecting them would soon be discovered. By this point, the events of the previous hours had already determined the outcome. What remained was the unavoidable transition from concealment to exposure as Soviet troops advanced through the area above. By the end of April 30th, 1945, the Führerbunker no longer served any political or military purpose. Adolf Hitler was dead, his final orders had been carried out, and the leadership structure he once controlled had effectively dissolved. Above ground, Soviet forces continued advancing through the government district without resistance from a centralized command. Inside the bunker, remaining occupants prepared for the inevitable. Some would attempt to escape later that night, while others would remain behind. Communications with the outside world were nearly silent, and no new directives were issued that could alter the course of events. Within 24 hours, the figure at the center of the Third Reich had been removed from history. The decisions made underground during that final day did not change the outcome of the war, but they marked the definitive end of Hitler's role in it. As Berlin fell, the bunker faded from relevance, becoming a sealed record of a regime's last hours, defined not by uncertainty, but by an outcome that had already been decided.